Chapter 3: Understanding the Human Experience. Transcending Dualism. Human experience is retrospective confirmation. The human experience is not it, but is the confirmation of it. The human experience is the linear unfoldment, running backward in time, so to speak, confirming the real. The world experience is present as confirmation of ineffability, searched for, expected, perceived, and understood. Not the ship, but the wake of the ship, or, as so many in history have put it, the tangible experience is the shadow of the real. That shadow is overspread with many shadows, infinite possibilities happening simultaneously, but each unfolding is forward moving in time. The central figure among the shadows is this one we call ourself, enshrouded in self-centeredness, selfishness, and ignorance. Its obligation is to become a passer-by and walk gently through the many shades of meaning, discerning the real confirmation of Godhead and resting therein, content that Godhead is indeed the all of all. Because Godhead is already, our physical discernment is actually retrospective and appears sequentially, forward-going and progressive in time and space. As everyone who has perceived this remarkable simplicity knows full well, it is nearly impossible to express it in writing. Why? How can one speak fully of multi-dimensional allness while using words that are, after all, mere symbols of symbols, man-made, sequential, and locked into the habitual mode of thought that regards one's struggle to be from ignorance at the bottom to light at the top, while believing time and space to be the final dimension? Surely, a first step in discerning the real is the perception that all the shadow events are appearing within one's own head, so to speak. This inner nature of comprehension is central to everything. Lo, subjectivism is born. Subjectivism is the second plateau along the apparent climb upward, the intellectual, self-centered time, the arrogant and superior time. Remember, identity exists already, so the climb and progress and pathway and all things else in time and space are retrospective to and from the true nature of being. The pathway from ignorance to light, as it seems, is like one daydreaming aboard a ship, looking at the wake in the far distance, then following that wake backwards towards the ship where one is, thence, finally, in time, awakening to the presence of ship, whereon one sits and learns of the qualities and attributes of ship. Aboard the ship, one looks back at the wake and sees everything there confirming the fact of ship. His experience seeming like a long swim to reach the knowledge that identity is perfectly birthed and birthed within the ineffable. This analogy is not precise in all ways, but we will straighten every imprecise point before many more pages. Remember, reader with whirling head, we are moving through the thickets of cosmology and theology quickly, there is a breakout into a remarkable comprehension along the way. Be patient just a little longer. After all, time and space have puzzled thinkers for 10,000 years, and we are soon to understand them both. The pathway from the trailing edges of the wake back to the ship is often likened to climbing a mountain. At the peak, one discovers the true nature of identity, which life, awareness, has been all the while. The human experience is all mountain climb, none of it real, but all of it necessary retrospective confirmation of the real. It is important that the reader understand these metaphysical points if he is to get his intellectual itch scratched. This inverse order of events is seldom understood in metaphysical teaching, and few who call themselves students of truth have their subjectivism straight. But hear this. In truth, it makes no difference whether anyone understands Godhead or not. Godhead is self-understanding, happening in timelessness. Life is that happening in progress. But to understand God's allness is to be able to make it through these repeating human experiences and find the child identity made in the image of God. It is also to learn the grand equation, live it, and assist our own subjective view of others in making the climb successfully and returning to Source. We came from that timelessness, and we are going there again, to paraphrase the words of Jesus. The author doesn't claim to have reached the final peak of understanding, not knowing how many other mountains may remain to climb, but I have been shown the equation which is the pearl, the key to overcoming in this world. To say that another way, I am not at all times consciously aboard the ship, but I am holding the boarding ladder, reaching out for others, swimming my way. I stand atop to SHAN, one arm reaching up, holding the one arm reaching down to assist those on the slopes of the world. The true identity of the reader is in exactly the same place. Metaphysics suggests that a knowledge of images leads to a knowledge of what stands behind images. This has been precisely true in my experience. Specifically, a knowledge of the electromagnetic energies called light have led me straight to a greater knowledge of unbound, illimitable light, for which the limited light of the world is an image. My use of the term photon as a particle of light in some of the essays following does not cover the whole range of science's meanings for light, but it suffices to explain a most meaningful parallel in our rediscovery of identity. Just as light appears to behave in two ways, so we appear to have two identities, one of them limited and finite, the other quite infinite, one of them located as a point in time and space, the other virtually omnipresent, existing on both sides of time. Why the dual appearing of identity? Why does identity appear dual in nature? That is, why the real identity and the facsimile who struggles with ego and the like? Why the real and the one in the world who fools us so? Why the one atop to SHAN and the other on the slopes? If God is all in all and omnipotent, why not one identity to start with, pure, perfect, made in the image of God? Why the second man, made of the elements of the earth? Religion stopped trying to answer this question in the first century of Christianity. Metaphysics has given no practical answer whatsoever. The body of this book will answer that ancient enigma to the satisfaction of scientists and philosophers alike. First, understand that the genuine identity, the soul of us, the child of us, is that one atop the mountain, unbound by time and space, residing in the heart of Godhead beyond name, and simultaneously everywhere on SHAN, not unlike the simple photon which, moving at the speed of light, is virtually everywhere in time and space nearly simultaneously. That is the genuine and only identity, image of God's self, as God made it. Our time on SHAN, perhaps many linear lifetimes, certainly nearly 11,000 years in the present experience, is our descent into matter, or into hell, as it is spoken of theologically. That is, it is the time of learning via contradistinction. It is the accumulation of conscious knowledge wherein the experiences on SHAN allow one to comprehend and fully appreciate the wonders of ineffability and the rediscovery of the original identity. This embodied human struggler is the second identity, the one apparently bound to time and space, destined to measure tangibility to its limits in his quest for the original. The second identity, arising after the mist, is man's tendency to forget his birthright, moving away from God toward selfness, into ego and multiplicity. As the tree of life prepares to bloom and seed, there will be a universal reversal of this tendency. We find the child still alive and untouched within us. We begin the conscious return to the Father's house, light beyond light. Our difficult times on SHAN bring our appeals to ineffability, God, for deliverance and salvation. Who doesn't turn to God when he's striving or when his life is threatened? The entity, the angel nearest us, beside the ineffable itself, is always present, ever listening to us and knowing our condition and thoughts. It is the original child of us awaiting that call, eager to answer, capable of taking us through the monstrous metaphysical mazes of our own making. Our experiences on SHAN are exactly what is necessary to bring us knowledge, thence to exchange the personal sense, the climber's role, for the child. Every step we make consciously up the mountain, we are less the climber and more the child, until, atop SHAN, with the world under our feet, we have consciously returned to the child of God, this time knowing our heritage. There, which is right here where the struggler reads these words, we encompass all the world at once, subjectively, and become the no place, no thing, where the ineffable flows through to tangibility, and becomes our new subjective world, and where the world's tangible essences return to ineffability. We become the no place, no thing, way, the door between ineffability and the world. This is what pure life has always been, the exchange point, the midpoint between above and below, outside and inside, first and last, male and female, spirit and matter. It is metaphysical folly to lay claim to identity who isn't a climber, without making the paradoxical climb in linear time. The illustration of the artist. A wondrous artist sits down and says, "Let me make a mighty work of art. It will be a perfect image and likeness of myself. I shall make this image so perfectly it will even know itself in its fullness, and it will know that I made it." The consummate artist proceeds to make an image of himself that comes alive. Well, now, consider. What would this image fully know about itself? What would it know about its joy and dominion, qualities of its maker? What would it know about infinity and eternity, or any of the attributes of itself? Thinking about this, we might ask ourselves what we know about the joys of the child when we were children. Nothing really. We had to leave childhood before we knew what we left behind. As a child, what did we know about those carefree days of security and dominion? What did we know about who we really are and who we are not? Nothing, until we were exposed to adulthood, the life that is not the child. With adulthood, and for quantum mankind in general, and having walked the roads of the world, some of us through religion into subjectivism, with those roads apparently leading nowhere, we finally hear of the child again and find it. This time we know what the child is. Finally, after 11,000 world years of human history, we have a simple, understandable statement that explains precisely why the appearances of evil exist in the world, and those charged with instructing others are not interested, as if it were not important. The terrors of the world are the chrysalis of self-discovery. We emerge from the necessary far country of ignorance and its anguish to rediscover the child within and return to the Father's house. Knowing is not being. Hans said, "Let the illustration of SHAN make your religion, philosophy, and science clear. It can if you let it. Sometimes it is easier to see a parallel pathway than the crowded one we are walking on." The ruler of SHAN, the prince of this world, is the belief that the world is matter in the final reality. It is also the belief that the body one calls his own is one's identity. These are most powerful and persuasive beliefs, particularly the latter one. Yet, if we examine these beliefs, we see that they are temporary and necessary mistakes. The mistake of knowing temporarily accepted as being. This mistake, which is no mistake at all in the final sense, lasts only for the duration of the body's time. The mistaken acceptance is rejected, involuntarily perhaps, in the death of the body. The little group sat pondering. They didn't understand. "Let me say this another way," said the teacher. "Being includes knowing, but knowing cannot include all of being. If one is to fully understand himself to be God's self-knowing, let him know what he is not. Then he will fully know what he is. The child is the child. but doesn't realize it until he has lived the adult. And then, when the child is uncovered, that one knows the child. Awareness is the knowing of the real God. The God of SHAN would have us make the personal identity into a God, and we try with terrible futility. The illustration of the symphony. Once upon a time, a weary old nearsighted mule was confined to a small barbed wire enclosed pasture filled with brambles. One day the mule unwittingly backed into the briars. In surprised pain, it leaped over the fence to find itself in a pasture infinitely lusher than the one before. Question: should the mule condemn the brambles for their thorns, or thank them for being the instrument to the greater sense of freedom? Thank them, certainly, but humanity as a whole doesn't do that. Why not? The answer isn't as obvious as it seems, and the question deserves a careful answer. Subjectivism offers an answer which will also serve as a primer for answering many metaphysical questions that arise in our study of truth. Here is the answer, delineated backward, as metaphysics often does things. I call it the illustration of the symphony. A knowledge of the symphony begins as a knowledge of the individual or personal notes that delineate the symphony. One cannot separate the symphony from the notes that delineate it, but the power, the authority, lies with the symphony, which is being the notes. The notes live, move, and have their being because the symphony, Godhead, exists. The symphony is eternal, and so are the notes that make it plain, but the notes are finite and tangible, while the symphony is infinite and intangible. How so? Because infinite means whole, all, complete, all in all, and all-inclusive. And one note is not the whole symphony. Since that note is not infinite, it is finite, measurable, possesses form, and is concerned with sequence or time. Every musician knows that as the notes are seen, understood, and heard, the symphony behind them begins to come to conscious attention. And once the intangible symphony is memorized, our dependence on the tangible, finite notes has lessened. But the notes still exist because the symphony is eternally self-known, self-delineated. That is, the symphony will forever know itself in its wholeness and in its detail. Likewise, as with the symphony, our knowledge of the infinite identity begins as a knowledge of the individual, finite people, places, and things within awareness. Who can deny that the tangible universe appears as the delineation of isness, the ineffable? One cannot separate images from the isness being images that delineate it, but the power lies with isness being the sights, sounds, and images of awareness. People, places, and things have their being because isness, symphony, is. Godhead is eternal, and so is the essence of matter, form, as today's grade school students knows. But Godhead is infinite and intangible, while the images of awareness are apparently finite and tangible. How so? Again, because not one thing, nor all of them together can be all there is to Godhead, any more than all the notes on the entire score of the symphony can be all there is to the symphony sounded, heard, and lived. As with the symphony, when the sights, sounds, and feelings of the world are seen and understood, Godhead comes more to conscious, tangible attention, and line upon line, precept upon precept, we find our dependence on things has also lessened. This includes our dependence on liquor, drugs, lawyers, wheelchairs, and hospitals. Not to mention the need to attack others' images or suffer confusion about how to defend the child's self from situations that delineate our immutability. More about the symphony. Consider an infinite and living symphony. Living means awareness, life. Awareness means knowing. Our symphony knows itself. That is what delineation is all about in the first place. That is why the measurable, finite notes on the paper, why the appearance of a finite world of interrelated people, places, things, and combinations thereof. The symphony knows itself in its intangible wholeness, and this means, listen, that the symphony also knows what knowing is. If the symphony knows all it is, doesn't it know what knowing is as well? Of course. Therefore, since knowing is not all there is to symphony, the symphony not only knows itself in its wholeness, it knows itself in parts, in its infinite variety, in its individual notes that delineate itself to itself, itself to itself. Consequently, the symphony knows finite form, time, and sequence as well as intangibility. Furthermore, it knows. Patient reader, no illustration is perfect in every detail. They can be picked to pieces. Ponder this one gently and find the glimpse it discloses. Follow it with the heart, not the intellect that insists on limit. Because our analogy is presuming an infinite symphonic Godhead, we perceive that knowing is the only real knowing going on. An infinite symphony knows that its knowing is without limit, restriction, or boundary. Yet, that knowing is not all there is to Godhead. At this point, we are able to ask the intellect a question that the heart can answer already. Does an infinitely wise symphony know what it is not, and could never really be? Yes, it would also know its is-nots were fictitious impossibles, the delineators that allow wisdom, knowing, to be infinitely wise. Of course it would, else its knowing would not be unlimited knowing, hence not omniscience at all. And finally, to the awakening point of difference here. Would not our omniscient symphony perceive, without fear or confusion, that a sharp or a flat note was but an adverse delineation of the correct note? And would not the wise symphony perceive that the fiction, no matter how it sounded, was not but a marker of the real? Yes, such a symphony would know exactly what delineates, identifies itself to itself in its detail to infinity. Consequently, for each note there is a knowledge of the fictitious, of seemingly real is-nots to outline it, wheat and tares. And the symphony knows the is from the hypothetical is-nots necessary to define itself to infinity. Reader, let us be very simple here. This isn't as difficult or as twisting as it sounds. It is the knowledge that our hand is not yon bird, mountain, meadow, and all else that renders the total knowledge of the form called hand. When we speak of symphony and its multitude of notes, we are not talking duality or multiplicity, but referring to one symphony in the action of knowing itself. Mind and its self-awareness are one mind being all-knowing. Omniscient means infinite knowing. Infinite means without limit. Knowing, limited to only what is limited knowing. To unlimitedly know what is means to automatically know what is not and could never be. And within the arena of tangibility, which is what knowing is, the latter appears just as tangible as the real, yet it is a holographic fiction, limited light attempting to outline light. So it is our conscious experience, so much concerned with finite images of perception, is like looking out upon a vast symphony of that which, in our wisdom, we can examine in its wholeness, or sprig by sprig. And this gleaming field of wheat is the what identity knows identity to be. Even as we know what the field is, we know what it is not and could never be. The appearance of tares strewn throughout, tares outlining every sprig, and even the tares pointing to the real, exactly as poverty delineates sufficiency, as hatred delineates love, as fear clarifies confidence and trust, as death points to life. Heretofore, the old objective teachings had us busily pulling up the brambles and the tares, rooting them out, trying to heal them, change or destroy them, in the name of God, good, of course. Now we see them as the powerless delineations of the real, and remain untouched by them. We finally understand the strange admonition to leave the tares alone until the harvest. The apparent dualism is ended. It is no longer light and darkness. It is every bit light, and its infinite self-distinction. It is no longer life and death. It is all life, and the powerless delineation of all that life knows it is not, and could never be. It is no longer a matter of peace beyond understanding, and unremitting warfare against terrorism, disease, agony, principalities and powers, sin, sickness, and death. It is all childlike peace. We eternally are, and the world, which is everything that makes that peace fully known. Finally, the two become a single one, as Jesus put it. And great God, what a day this realization is. 1 mule in 1,000. Now we see why only 1 mule in 1,000, 2 in 10,000, see their anguish as their blessing. The rest write indignant letters to the board of bramble directors, lower the boom on them with uprooting criticism, and wail in anguish at the sound the thorns make in their organizations. All the while, it is the mule's wind whistling through the thicket. One leper returned to thank the carpenter for his healing work. This illustration suggesting that for every clear chord delineating the symphony, there are 9 times 9 sour notes outlining that chord. This is why we find in the early literature of all schools that not everyone who appears to be living is necessarily alive. A little more about SHAN. Birth and death on the face of SHAN are the ongoingness of eternity, appearing in time. Beyond the body that is alive and dead is awareness, which is eternal. Awareness is the balance between movement and rest, birth and death. Awareness is life, whereas the living body is only the image of awareness. Male and female on the face of SHAN are the first outpicturing of the whole identity, but still image. Genderless being is the balance, whereas the gendered form is image of image. Above and below on the face of SHAN are the ongoingness of ineffability. We surrender the image's self-importance to the image, the child of God, who leads us to all truth. It is true, the peak of SHAN is an intangible nothingness wherein all image importance is surrendered to the image, the child of God, who leads us consciously to Godhead. Even the Son of God makes himself nothing before the Father, ineffable one of all. Confirmation defined. Godhead is the eternal fact. The universe of tangibility is its self-confirmation following in time. God is infinite and eternal. Space and time exist in the arena of self-confirmation, wherein events are sequential. Identity is singular Godhead. The appearance of multitudes is its confirmation to all possibilities following in time and space. Godhead's life is omnipresent, and the forms of life are its confirmation following in all degrees. Enlightenment is Godhead's self-knowing. Our glimpses and glimmers are its inevitable confirmation. One already is the fact. Near infinite numbers of possibilities are its confirmation following. Godhead is one already, and all objectivity and subjectivity in their many dimensions are God's confirmation following. Science is the leading edge of intellectualism, the inevitable confirmation of Godhead. Nothing is going on but God. All that's going on here in time and space is layer upon layer of confirming appearances, limited light's inward spiral. The appearances have no God in them or within them, yet the appearances exist within Godhead. Confirmations, majestic as they are neither real nor unreal, but they exist with Godhead and are God's self-knowledge happening eternally. The awareness that reads these words and seems to write them is God's knowing happening, and That happening is confirmation of the One. The confirmation is not Godhead, but exists for its self-certification and joy. Now, our subjectivism straight, the reading will be easier.